The dim ceiling lights of St. Vincent's Hospice buzzed faintly above as Caleb Monroe sat hunched over in his scuffed plastic chair beside his father's bed. The slow mechanical beeping of the heart monitor pulsed like a quiet clock measuring the fading rhythm of Howard Monroe's life. Caleb rubbed his aching eyes raw from exhaustion and glanced at his phone for the fifth time that hour, still nothing. "Did your family say they were coming?" Nurse Simmons asked softly as she adjusted Howard's oxygen. Caleb let out a hollow breath, forcing a weary smile. "They said they would. I called them all last night." It had been 3 days since Howard's condition had suddenly worsened. 3 long, silent days where Caleb had sat alone keeping vigil. His wife Natalie had claimed she couldn't leave her leadership role at the Green Valley Food Drive. His older brother Trevor had promised his system Maris kept. "The doctor says it won't be much longer." "Nurse Simmons, do you want me to try calling them?" Caleb shook his head, voice low. He turned back toward the fragile man in the bed, once the pillar of their family. Caleb's mind filled with memories of how Howard had raised 3 children alone after their mother passed away over 20 years ago. Howard home. And now at 71, cancer was about to steal him away. Caleb was the only one who, "Hey?" His phone buzzed again, a message from Natalie. "How's it going?" "The food drive is a madhouse. The Parkers just offered to triple their sponsorship if I make them official partners. Talk later." No mention of Howard, no offer to come, just another line from her charity hustle. Caleb slid the phone back into his pocket, his throat tightening. Their marriage had been eroding for years, but this felt like the final blow. At 39, Caleb had built Monroe Custom Woodworks from nothing, crafted a reputation, provided Natalie with a designer home in Ashwood Heights, and met every demand she'd ever made. Yet here he was, alone, waiting for the inevitable. The door opened quietly. The doctor stepped in, checked Howard's vitals, and turned to Caleb with a solemn nod. "It's time to say your goodbyes, Mr. Monroe." Almost as if sensing his presence, Howard's eyelids fluttered weakly. "Caleb," he rasped, barely more than a whisper, "you're here." "Of course I'm here, Dad," Caleb murmured, leaning closer and wrapping his hands gently around his father's frail fingers. "I've been here the whole time." A faint ghost of a smile flickered on Howard's pale lips. "And the others, are they coming?" Caleb swallowed the bitter truth and lied softly. "Yeah, they're on their way." But Howard, even through the cloud of medication dulling his senses, seemed to see right through the false hope. He gave Caleb's hand a weak squeeze. "No, they're not," he whispered, his breath barely audible. "And that's all right. There's something you need to know." He struggled to raise a hand, motioning for Caleb to lean closer. When Caleb did, Howard's lips trembled with effort. "Bottom drawer of my old desk. Keys taped under the toolbox lid. What you find, it'll explain everything." Caleb frowned, confused. "Dad, what do you mean?" Howard's grip tightened ever so slightly, urgency flickering in his fading voice. "Promise me you'll look, Caleb. Promise." "I promise," Caleb whispered back, his throat burning with emotion. Howard let out a shaky breath, sinking deeper into the pillows. You were always the strong one," he whispered faintly, "just like your mother." His eyelids fluttered shut again. "The others, they're not who you think they are." The monitor beside him stretched into a long, steady tone, "Nurse." Simmons rushed forward, but Caleb already knew Howard Monroe was gone. As the doctor quietly announced the time of death, Nurse Simmons approached with something in her hand. "He asked me to give you this when the time came." With trembling hands, Caleb took the sealed envelope. His name was written across the front in his father's familiar handwriting. A sudden commotion broke the fragile silence outside the room. Trevor and Marissa had finally arrived, dressed impeccably, voices rising in manufactured grief as they demanded to see their father. "You're too late," Caleb said coldly, stepping into the hallway. "He's gone." Marissa let out a dramatic sob, collapsing onto a bench. "We tried. The traffic was impossible." Trevor adjusted his designer cufflinks, scowling. "Some of us have real responsibilities, Caleb. We can't all sit around for days like you." And behind them, standing awkwardly near the wall, was Natalie, dressed in expensive silk, clutching her handbag. "I came as soon as I could," she muttered, avoiding Caleb's eyes. Caleb let out a bitter breath, feeling the heavy envelope in his pocket. "How convenient," he replied coldly. "All of you showing up exactly after he's gone." Before anyone could respond, a hospital administrator approached with a clipboard. "I'm so sorry for your loss. There are a few matters we need to go over regarding arrangements." Trevor, Marissa, and Natalie immediately followed, already bickering about costs before they even reached the elevator. Caleb stayed back, slipping quietly toward the exit without another word. Sitting in his car outside the hospice, Caleb finally tore open the envelope with shaking fingers. My dearest Caleb, if you're reading this, I've already gone to be with your mother. I'm so sorry to leave you with this burden, but you deserve the truth. The safety deposit box at Summit Ridge, bank key enclosed, holds evidence that Trevor, Marissa, and yes, even Natalie have been stealing from us for years. The land your grandfather left us, the property, Trevor insisted was worthless and sold to help the family, was worth millions. The family trust fund you believed had run dry. It was drained into offshore accounts. Even Monroe Custom Woodworks has been compromised. Most importantly, you are not alone. Find Gerald Whitaker in Maple Creek. He knows everything. He'll help you understand the rest. With all my love, Dad, Caleb sat motionless, staring at the letter, as heavy raindrops began to splatter across the windshield. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his marriage, his business had just shattered in an instant. Hours later, back in his father's old study, Caleb located the bottom drawer of the battered oak desk. He slid the key into the lock, his heart pounding. Inside lay a weathered spiral notebook, a small USB drive, and several thick folders carefully labeled by date. With trembling hands, Caleb opened the first folder. Bank statements, property sale records, forged business contracts, photographs, grainy but unmistakable, of Trevor, Marissa, and most painfully Natalie, sitting across from Mason Crowley, Howard's longtime financial consultant. Bile rose in Caleb's throat. His phone buzzed on the desk. Caleb, where the hell are you? Natalie's voice snapped through the receiver. We're all waiting at the attorney's office for the will reading. Caleb closed the folder with slow deliberation. I'm on my way, he replied coldly. Don't start without me. When Caleb walked into Harrington and Wells' law office, the air felt thick enough to choke on. Trevor sat stiffly beside Marissa, who kept glancing at her watch. Natalie stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Marissa huffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. Some of us have lives to get back to, Caleb. The family attorney, Walter Harrington, cleared his throat to break the tension. Now that everyone is present, we'll proceed with the reading of Howard Monroe's last will and testament. What came next left the room stunned. Howard had revised his will just 2 months before his death. The ancestral land that Trevor had long coveted was to be sold, with all proceeds donated to veterans' mental health programs. The rare woodworking tool collection, which Marissa had already bragged about inheriting, was donated to the city's historical society. Caleb was named sole executor of the estate, with Trevor and Marissa receiving only a token inheritance of $500 each. Trevor shot to his feet, his face turning crimson. This is a joke. He wasn't thinking clearly. Marissa leaned forward, her voice sharp as glass. You manipulated him when he was sick, didn't you? But Harrington remained unshaken. The will was signed in the presence of 2 independent doctors who confirmed his full mental capacity. Additionally, there's a video statement explaining his decisions in his own words. Caleb stayed silent, watching as his siblings seethed. Natalie, standing by the window, didn't say a word. She just stared at the floor, gripping her handbag tighter. After the meeting, Natalie finally approached him, her voice low and hesitant. Caleb, about dinner tonight. I won't be home. Caleb cut her off coldly. Don't wait up. Without giving her a chance to respond, Caleb turned and walked out. The drive to Maple Creek took just under an hour. The small, quiet town hadn't changed much since Caleb had visited as a child. Following his father's letter, Caleb arrived at a modest little house with a neatly kept yard. Nothing like the high-rise offices and gated estates Natalie had dragged him to over the years. When the door opened, Caleb found himself staring at an older man in his 70s with snow-white hair and strikingly familiar eyes. You must be Caleb, the man said warmly, as though he had been expecting him. You look just like your mother. Over cups of black coffee at the kitchen table, the man introduced himself. I'm Gerald Whitaker. He said softly, I knew your mother long before she met your father. We reconnected after she passed. Gerald added, his voice heavy with memory. But your father wanted us to keep it quiet. He worried it would cause jealousy with Trevor and Marissa. Gerald slid a worn photograph across the table. It showed a younger version of Anna Monroe, Caleb's mother, standing arm in arm with Gerald, both beaming with happiness. 3 years ago, your father noticed money going missing. He hired a private investigator, and he knew exactly what Trevor, Marissa, and Natalie were doing. Gerald added quietly. Caleb stared at the photo, his heart pounding, when Gerald paused, clearly struggling with the weight of what came next. "There's something else you deserve to know," Gerald said at last, his voice low and hesitant. Caleb leaned in, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Gerald drew in a slow, heavy breath. "Trevor and Marissa, they're not your biological siblings, Caleb." Caleb's mouth went dry. He leaned back, stunned. "What are you saying?" Gerald nodded slowly, the weight of the truth evident in his expression. "Before your mother met your father, she had a brief, difficult marriage to someone else. It didn't last, but Trevor and Marissa were born from that relationship." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as Gerald continued. "Your father knew. He knew from the very beginning, but he loved them anyway, raised them like his own flesh and blood, never treating them any differently than he did you." Caleb pressed his hands to the table, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him. "But you, Caleb, you were the only child they had together by blood," Gerald added quietly. The truth hit Caleb like a blow to the gut. Decades of subtle family tensions suddenly snapped into focus. The way Trevor had always competed for their father's approval. The way Marissa had always acted like something was owed to her. Is that why they started stealing from him, from me?" Caleb asked hoarsely. Gerald nodded grimly. "They found out the truth years ago. That's when the resentment started to fester. But that's not all, Caleb." Gerald reached under the table and slid a thick manila folder across to him. "Mason Crowley," he said darkly. "He's been helping them. Trevor, Marissa, and Natalie drained not just your father's accounts, but your business as well." Caleb's pulse quickened as he opened the folder. His stomach twisted as he flipped through the damning evidence. Forged loan documents, fake property transfers, offshore account records, bank transactions authorized by Natalie, the wife who had insisted on taking over the bookkeeping for Monroe Custom Woodworks. His blood boiled as realization set in. As Caleb flipped through the damning pages, the scope of the betrayal became even clearer. Property sales signed off with Trevor posing as Caleb's silent business partner. Loans taken out against Monroe Custom and Woodworks, all without Caleb's knowledge or consent. With a surge of fury, Caleb slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing through the quiet kitchen. "Why didn't he tell me?" Caleb demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of it all. Gerald leaned forward, his voice low and heavy with regret. He was going to, but he was scared. He knew Mason Crowley wasn't just a crooked advisor. He had dangerous connections. Your dad wanted to gather every piece of evidence first, to keep you out of harm's way until he was sure. Almost on cue, Caleb's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. Unknown number 1, single chilling text, "Back for you'll regret it, the money's gone." "Accept it." Caleb's jaw clenched. His decision was already made. "I have to go," he whispered, standing abruptly. "There's something I need to finish." Late that night, Caleb walked back into his house. Natalie was waiting in the living room, swirling a glass of red wine, wearing the perfect mask of concern. "Finally," she breathed dramatically. "Where have you been? I've been worried sick." She moved toward him, reaching for his arm. Caleb took a step back, his expression unreadable. Cold. "Have you really?" His voice was flat, cutting through the air like a blade. Natalie flinched slightly but quickly recovered, forcing a sympathetic smile. "Of course, it's been a difficult day for all of us." Without responding, Caleb walked to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a whiskey, and took a long, deliberate sip. He turned slowly, his eyes locked on hers. "Tell me something, Natalie." His voice was deathly calm. "How long have you been working with Mason Crowley?" Natalie froze mid-step. The wine glass in her hand trembled, the red liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. What? I don't know what you're talking about." Caleb set the whiskey glass down on the table, leaning in closer. Voice dropping to a near whisper. "The offshore accounts, the forged signatures, the money you stole from my company." Caleb leaned in, voice cold as stone. "My father knew everything, Natalie. He documented every transfer, every forged signature, every betrayal." For the first time, Natalie's carefully constructed facade began to fracture. Her jaw tightened, her eyes flashing as her mask finally slipped. "Your saintly father never thought I was good enough for you," she snapped. "Trevor and Marissa told me what he was really like, controlling, manipulative. We deserve that money after everything we've put up with." "Everything?" Caleb shot back, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You mean after he paid your tuition? After he welcomed you into this family without hesitation? After he lent us the money to buy this house?" Natalie's expression darkened, her voice dropping into something colder, more venomous. You have no proof of anything. Caleb took a slow, deliberate step toward her voice, barely above a whisper. That's where you're wrong. And tomorrow, the authorities will have all of it. Natalie's face drained of color. She gripped the wine glass tighter, trying to mask the panic rising in her throat. You're bluffing, she hissed. Caleb leaned in even closer, the air between them turning icy. Try me. That night, Caleb heard Natalie whispering urgently on the phone in the guest room. He didn't need to eavesdrop. He already knew what she was planning. By morning, she was gone, the jewelry, the designer bags, the shared bank accounts, all emptied overnight. Once Caleb handed the folder of evidence to the authorities, the investigation moved swiftly. Federal agents had apparently been watching Mason Crowley for years, suspecting him of masterminding an elite financial fraud ring, but Caleb's case cracked the entire operation wide open. Trevor was arrested at SeaTac International Airport, caught attempting to board a private jet to Belize. Marissa was found at her lakeside rental, burning piles of paperwork in a frantic effort to erase the evidence. Natalie had vanished, but all her financial accounts had already been frozen at Howard Monroe's funeral. Caleb stood alone by the grave. Friends and distant relatives kept their distance, their whispers swirling around the fresh scandal like smoke. As the service ended, a firm hand touched his shoulder. Mr. Monroe? Caleb turned to see a tall woman with sharp, perceptive eyes and a police badge clipped to her coat. Detective Alex Hartley. She introduced herself. I need to speak with about your wife's disappearance. Over the weeks that followed, Caleb worked closely with Detective Hartley to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. Mason Crowley had identified Caleb's father years ago, preying on Howard's vulnerability after Anna's death. He had expertly fueled Trevor and Marissa's resentment over their true parentage, turning them into willing conspirators. And when Natalie grew tired of Caleb's devotion to his family's legacy over her social status, she became Crowley's final recruit. They planned to leave you with nothing, Hartley told him quietly during one of their late-night case reviews. Bankrupt alone, stripped of everything your family ever built. Detective Alex Hartley leaned back in her chair, her voice calm but laced with quiet sympathy. Once they drained everything, she explained. Natalie planned to file for divorce, blaming you for the financial collapse. On paper, it would look like you destroyed the marriage while she walked away with whatever scraps were left. Caleb let out a bitter, humorless laugh, raking his hand through his hair. And I never saw it coming, he muttered. Hartley nodded slowly. Most people don't, not when it's family. As the investigation widened, Caleb learned that Mason Crowley's scheme was far more massive than he'd imagined. Dozens of families, small businesses, retired couples, lifelong friends had been manipulated, defrauded, and left in financial ruin. But as Caleb worked alongside the task force providing evidence, testimonies, and whatever they needed, he began to feel something unexpected. A sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was standing up for every family Crowley had destroyed. 6 months after Howard's funeral, the last piece of the puzzle finally fell into place. Natalie was located and arrested in Costa Rica, just outside a luxury resort under a fake name. Caleb stood at a distance outside the courthouse as she was led inside in handcuffs. She never once looked back at him. By then, Trevor and Marissa had already taken plea deals, offering up full cooperation in exchange for reduced prison time. That evening, Caleb returned to his father's house, the house he could never bring himself to sell no matter what the will had said. Somehow it still felt more like home than anywhere else in the world. Sitting on the front porch was Gerald Whitaker, waiting quietly as though no time had passed. You did it, Gerald said softly, standing to meet him. Caleb swallowed, hard emotion thick in his throat. Do you think they'd be proud? Gerald placed a steady hand on his shoulder. They were always proud of you, Caleb. Gerald reached into his coat and handed Caleb an old weathered wooden box. Your dad wanted you to have this. When it was all over, inside the box, Caleb found small, deeply personal treasures. Faded Polaroid photos of his parents beaming with joy in better days. Thus a handwritten recipe for his father's famous Sunday chili, his mother's silver wedding band, and one final folded letter. My dearest Caleb, by now I know you've uncovered the truth. I'm so sorry for the pain this has caused you, but not for protecting you as long as I could. Some may say I should have told you sooner, but a father's instinct is to shield his child even when that child is grown. What matters now is what you build from here. The lies have been torn down. What you choose to build in their place, that's entirely up to you. Always remember, Caleb, family isn't always blood. It's the people who stay when others walk away. With all my love, Dad, Caleb folded the letter carefully, pressing it to his chest. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle in his heart. When he looked up, Gerald was watching him closely. He said, "Family isn't always blood," Caleb whispered. "Was he talking about you?" Gerald's lips curled into a bittersweet smile. "Partly, Mom," he said softly, "but there's someone else you should meet." Gerald nodded toward the street. A silver sedan was parked along the curb. Standing beside it was a young woman nervously fidgeting with her hands, watching them with hesitant curiosity. "This is Lena," Gerald introduced as she approached the porch. "5 years ago, your father helped her escape an abusive relationship. He gave her a new identity, helped her start fresh, even got her a job at the Monroe Community Foundation. Since then, she's been like a daughter to him." Lena extended her hand, her voice soft but steady. "Your father spoke about you often, Mr. Monroe. He always said you were the only one who truly carried your mother's heart." That evening, the three of them sat on the porch sharing stories about Howard long into the night. For the first time since his father's illness and began, Caleb felt something he hadn't realized he'd been missing all along: belonging. Here with two people who had once been strangers, bound not by blood but by Howard's kindness, Caleb felt more at home than he ever had with Trevor, Marissa, or Natalie. A year later, Caleb stood before the Howard Monroe Memorial Garden, newly dedicated at St. Vincent's Hospice. The prosecution of Mason Crowley and his network had been successful. Justice had been served. Caleb had rebuilt Monroe Custom Woodworks from the ground up, this time with honest partners by his side. The dark cloud of betrayal no longer loomed over his life. Standing beside him at the ceremony was Detective Alex Hartley. Alex, as he now called her. What had started as a professional partnership had quietly grown into something far deeper. They hadn't rushed it, both knew what it meant to carry scars, but they had built something rare: trust. Gerald and Lena had also become permanent fixtures in Caleb's life. Sunday dinners had returned to Howard's old house, now filled with laughter and new memories. Together, they had launched the Monroe Legacy Foundation, offering support to victims of fraud and domestic abuse, carrying on Howard's quiet legacy of second chances. As the small crowd began to drift away after the dedication, Alex reached for Caleb's hand, giving it a soft squeeze. "You okay?" she asked gently. Caleb glanced at the garden, vibrant with his mother's favorite wildflowers. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You know, for the first time in a long time, I really think I am." In his pocket, the letter from his father rested, worn but cherished. He didn't need to read it anymore. The words had already shaped his future. The truth that had once shattered his world had set him free, and now his real life was finally ready to begin. The past was set in stone beyond anyone's reach. But the future was a blank page waiting to be written.